This is Chapter 12, The New Imperialism, Discussion Number 1, The Domination of Imperialism. One of the things that we have constantly seen as we've gone through these last few chapters is that imperialism requires a large amount of raw materials. The factories are gobbling up raw materials and spitting out new and finished products, and at an extremely high rate. Higher rates than the home countries themselves can generally supply. That's why a lot of the Industrial Revolution was about getting colonies that would provide those raw materials. But also, after the raw materials have been manufactured, you've got to have a place to sell these things. And so the colonies also served as the markets for those finished goods. But as we're getting into the late 1800s, early 1900s, we're seeing that colonies are not just about raw materials. They're also about supplying military bases around the world. Because if you're sailing ships from one point to another, they're going to need to have places to stop. Remember, the ships are no longer running on just wind. They're running on steam, which means that they need coal in order to keep their steam engines going. Also, military bases to protect the raw materials and to protect the colonies and protect the places where the ships are going to stop. And so we're going to see a lot of those ideas coming about through the Industrial Revolution and as we're getting into late 1800s and early 1900s. Of course, there's also other ideas that the humanitarian concept of helping the local people out, providing things to them that they need, trying to provide a more sustainable life in those areas, whether it be from sanitation, better diet, more food. Also, we have a lot of people, missionaries, going from places to places in order to try to establish for the area a religious presence and to share their good news, primarily Christian. But we do see some other religious movements during the time period. But there's also a belief that of what's called social Darwinism. Now, Darwinism is reference to the biological evolution of species from over time, macroevolution, microevolution. We're not going to get in that argument here. I know that as a Christian school, as soon as you hear the word evolution, you're supposed to think evil ideas. Social Darwinism was actually a belief that the better culture would win, that there was reasons why the Western culture was better, and the reason why the Western culture was overwhelming the local cultures, based on religion, based on private ownership, based on the individuality and the value of the individual versus the community, and how that provided strength and productivity throughout the entire culture. And people thought that there wasn't that much of a shame to overwhelm the local cultures because Western culture was simply better than everyone else. Now, Western advantages, what were they? First of all, industrially created weapons could kill people from farther away. If you're going to put a gun against a bow and arrow or a spear, who's going to win? On top of that, industrial economies could sustain larger, more organized armies because they sustained higher populations, because they grew more food. The governments were able to sustain larger bureaucracies because they had a lot more people and a lot more manufactured goods and a lot more food. However, there was some idea going on during this time period that the European powers were taking everything from the locals and not really giving back to them, and using them immorally as it was progressing. And so Western imperialism, while it was highly profitable and highly efficient, some people thought that it was destroying the lives of the local population. If you take a look at some of the more modern discussions with imperialism, well, we can compare it to what happened to the Indians over time in the United States. I'm sure many of you are familiar with those types of arguments, and seeing that going on carte blanche throughout the world as Western powers were establishing themselves militarily, economically, politically throughout the world in essentially pushing people around, and people saying that that was a bad thing to do. That is a moral judgment. That is a preference judgment. I'm not going to get into which way it ought to go, but that is the basics of the two sides of the argument. So when the Europeans got there and established themselves as being a power to be reckoned with, we essentially have three general formats of how the Europeans dominated the region. The first one is the one that we're quite familiar with, the idea of being a colony. Just like the United States were 13 separate colonies, they were under the direct rule of the home country. The home country governor was sent to run them, to make sure it was run exactly the way that the home country imposed power, and that was the way it had to go. However, there was another type of format called a protectorate, where it was necessary for the European power to establish and protect the local government. And so there would be a local ruler, they would make their rules, local decisions, and run the country, but they would have an advisor hanging around from that powerful European country who would give lots of hints on how they ought to run the country. And a lot of times it was, if you don't do what I tell you, then perhaps we could, have the military blow up some people, or maybe we'll discount, or we won't allow certain things to be shipped to your country, and a lot of blackmail type thing going on. So it kind of became a symbiotic relationship. And the last one wasn't really any type of official idea, but it's referred to as a sphere of influence. And this is where Europeans, even though they weren't directly controlling the areas, had so much power and had so much sway over local leadership that essentially it was a European country where it was. Now, we're not saying that they completely displaced the culture and it was like Great Britain was in the middle of Asia, but what it was is that the European military and political power was so dominating that the local leaders wouldn't dare push their luck against them. And so the Europeans would essentially push everyone else around. For example, let's say you got arrested for burglary while you were in another country, but this was a sphere of influence where your country was in charge, and they say, no, we're not going to have you tried by local courts, we're going to have you tried by a British court with British people. And that's one of the ideas that we like about trial by jury of your peers, is that you're going to be tried by people who have a similar bent or a similar passions. Whereas in this case, instead of being tried by people who are used to getting robbed or used to people who are angry at your particular nationality, you're going to get tried by your own people, and they'll probably be a lot more sympathetic. So one of the areas that we want to take a look at where this really was going on is in the Middle East. Now, the Ottoman Empire had established itself during the Middle Ages. The Ottoman Empire went up into the Balkan Peninsula, was primarily in Asia Minor, and had spread itself somewhat into what we call Palestine, or in the area of Israel right now. But a lot of different Middle Eastern leaders, while they tried to pretend or try to copy the European bureaucracies, they found themselves being pushed around a lot by the Europeans, and that was because the Ottoman Empire, while they did have a big muckety-muck who was making all of the big decisions, or at least trying to make the big decisions, didn't have the opportunity to actually enforce those decisions. And so the Ottoman Empire begins to decentralize because it wasn't very organized. And a lot of local people are starting to make bigger decisions and acting more separately and autonomously. And as these separate, smaller areas are acting autonomously and becoming weaker, then they are going to be more susceptible to being played off of each other, or that European powers are going to say, hey, we can give you a leg up on your neighbor because we've got some ideas to help you. So the Middle Eastern leaders, while they did emulate the European ideas, a lot of times they did that going away from Islam. But the European powers played big in the Middle East. Now, oil's not a big deal yet, but that becomes a really big player as we get into the 1910s and the 1920s. However, there's lots of other raw materials in the Middle East that is a big deal to the Europeans, and especially the idea of transportation. The idea of the Suez Canal in the Middle East is going to become a very big idea of transporting things between Europe and Asia, and getting in through the Middle East area. And plus, it's a big deal to have colonies, and this is an area where everyone wants to have their name put on a plaque. So that's why the Middle East becomes a really important idea during this time period, and why the Europeans start pushing people around. This concludes discussion number 1, the domination of imperialism, as part of Chapter 12, the New Imperialism.